Glad to have you here. It's Alex Salmond, former First Minister, speaking to CommonSpace. You've got a recent book launch that's come out. You're in the midst of a general election campaign, and you're speaking to us following 7 years as leader of Scotland and, of course, the independence referendum. I'll try my best to ask you some new questions, given you've been through quite a number of interviews over the years. But to start with, your new book focuses on the IndieRef campaign and provides an inside account of the campaign as it progressed, frictions with the mainstream media and your own hopes for change. What does the book add to discussion about the referendum?
I think two things. I mean, it tells the story from my perspective. I mean, there's no point in me trying in a book which is largely a diary, and the bit that are not a diary are a bit autobiographical and forecasts of what's going to happen, an essay saying what's going to happen in Scotland now. So there's no point in me trying to tell the story of the referendum. This is the story of the referendum from my perspective, because by definition, a diary has things from your perspective. No point in trying to say what somebody else was doing. A diary is about what you were doing. But I think, from that perspective, it gives people an insight. I've said at the various meetings I've been at that I'm very interested, because, obviously there'll be a paperback and a revised edition and all the rest of it, because it's topping the bestsellers list across the UK for 2 weeks running. I'd like the metropolitan media to explain that one. But, I'd be quite interested in people sending in their stories. And where I can, I'll try to get some of that into the paperback. But I can't make up, the stories from, let's say, CommonSpace, or I can't make up the stories from Women for Independence, or the variety of other grassroots organisations, National Collective, because I wasn't there. So I can't tell that story in a diary. I talk about them in the book, obviously, about the impression they had, the impact they had. But a diary, by its definition, tends to be personal. So I think what it adds is a personal view of the referendum campaign from the perspective of the First Minister who was leading the Yes campaign. And the second thing I think it adds is my thoughts on how social media has now changed the power balance in democratic societies. Because although societies were democratic in name, in reality, most Western capitalist liberal democracies had a very restrained and tightly gripped power balance between those who owned and controlled information, which was power, and those who didn't. I'm suggesting in the book that that balance is now changing, and we saw the first, well, not the first, but early signs of that in Scotland. And I think that will have huge ramifications for democratic societies, that the power is now much more evenly distributed, because information is now much more evenly distributed.
The book also presented your case and hopes in the lead up to the vote, when you say you were highly confident that Yes was on the way to winning the referendum. Do you think there's been enough introspection since the vote on why Yes lost?
I do, actually. I think obviously that for those in the Yes campaign, we have to develop our arguments. We have to realise we did lose, and how do you win? In Scotland, as of now, certainly as of last year, and probably as of now, there's about 60% of people could vote Yes under the right circumstances. And we have to work out how to take 45% to 60%. Can we do that? Well, we did work out how to take 30%, which is where we started 2 years ago, to 45%, so therefore it should be possible, by definition, to take 45% to 60%. Yes, we have to think about how we do that. But introspection, well, it's a bit like I say what my granddad taught me when I was a wee boy. You certainly should think about the past to learn from it, but you shouldn't dwell on it, and you certainly shouldn't live in it. So I'm not sure about introspection, but just recognise that we started at 30, we got to 45, and we need to get to 60. Incidentally, that total catchment is increasing all the time. So maybe it was 60 last year, maybe it's 61 this year, just because of changes in the population and the nature of people. And what's fascinating, and what was confirmed actually by the election study from Essex and Edinburgh, I don't agree with everything, incidentally, in that study, but I do agree with this, that the differentiation in class groups and age groups it certainly conforms to my experience. I think they got a couple of things wrong. Basically, that study indicates, that 60% of 18 to 25-year-olds voted yes, and right down to roughly 25% of over 70s, and right through the age groups, you get a movement from yes to no. The older you are, the more likely you are to vote no. It actually does challenge the view that the richer you are, the more likely you are to vote no. In fact, that study would indicate that as the upper middle class were the most no people, even more so than, certainly than very poor people who were the most yes people, or very rich people who weren't yes, but they weren't as no as the upper middle class were. So we have to work out, understand these class, to a certain extent geographical, but certainly age differentials. The reason I disagree with that study to an extent is I'm not certain it's just a matter of how old somebody is or how rich somebody is. I think it's almost more a matter of where they get the information from. And I think to some extent, not to an overwhelming extent, but to some extent the age differential is explained by the flow of information. In other words, many old people, not all, but many, get their information from the traditional press and the BBC. Most overwhelmingly young people, not all, but the vast majority, get their information from the social media. So to a great extent, what they are recognising as an age differential is actually an information differential. That's one way I disagree with them. I disagree with them obviously in the vow as well. I think they totally, completely misunderstand the importance of the vow. And they also misunderstand the essential lesson that anybody who spends a year or two in politics understand, that people don't always say to you exactly what they mean. Well, the challenging thing that an academic researcher has to understand is that just because somebody says something in a survey doesn't necessarily mean that's exactly what they did. Doesn't mean they're lying to you. It just means that sometimes people feel it easier to... Nobody wants to say that they were fooled or gulled or taken in. People like to say there was a substantial reason for doing something. That's human nature. Nothing wrong with it. Doesn't mean people are bad. It's just what people are. And sometimes academic surveys misunderstand the human interrelationship, just as economists often misunderstand. I mean, founder of economics, the greatest economist of all time, Adam Smith. Why is he not just the founder of economics, but the greatest economist of all time? Because he understood human nature. He didn't just understand markets. He understood human nature. Sometimes, some people don't understand human nature. And I think that study didn't understand human nature.
It's interesting that you mentioned that particular study and economics, because the main reason given by no voters in that survey for voting no was concerns over the economy. So while there was support for the case put forward on improving productivity, innovation, greater levels of investment, there were other policy areas such as the tax cuts in Scotland's future or the policy on the currency which created greater controversy. So you spoke about policy development. Do you think there's a case for greater work to be done in these areas to improve the economic case for independence?
Yeah, I mean, of course there's a case for improving the position that you put forward. You'd have to be a fool not to understand that. But equally, there is a understandable wish to pretend that, well, if only this had happened or that had happened. I've said, look, there are certain differences if I had benefit 2020 hindsight that I would make in the presentation of certain aspects. Let's, for example, the currency argument. Basically, in my presentation of the currency argument, I was trying to avoid what actually did happen in the last week of the campaign. That is the presentation by the BBC and the written press that the Royal Bank of Scotland and Lloyds were going to evacuate Scotland. Now, of course, it was rubbish. They weren't going to evacuate Scotland under any circumstances. At most it was going to happen is they were going to move the position of the registered office, because that's not how it was portrayed. Quote a BBC report, Lloyds Bank are going to move their headquarters from Glasgow to London. It's an interesting proposition, since Lloyds Bank have never had a headquarters in Glasgow. They've never had a headquarters in Edinburgh either, incidentally. The headquarters were first in Birmingham and for the last 30 years in London. But I knew, or for that matter, the Royal Bank. I mean, the Royal Bank's headquarters is in either Lombard Street in London or Gogarburn in Edinburgh. Its registered office is not in either of these places. It's 36 in Andrew Square, where I used to work. But I was aware that the presentation of that particular argument by the press we have would be difficult. True or not, difficult. And therefore I was trying to avoid that happening. Now it happened anyway, but I was trying to avoid it. And to be fair to the banks, they were trying to avoid it as well, but they got pressurised, cornered by the Treasury in a totally unscrupulous way with a week to go in the campaign. So you might ask yourself, should I have thought, oh well, that presentation is going to happen anyway, therefore I shouldn't be trying to avoid it, or should you say, well, let's see if we can avoid that misrepresentation being made, that attempt to scare people being made. And with the benefit of hindsight, I'd have been better to take a different position, but you know, you don't have that benefit of hindsight. But again, what I'd say to our academic researcher friends, clearly the economic case for independence is crucial, of course it is. But people, when you ask them why they did something, do not say necessarily what was actually the case. They don't, because it's far easier for someone to say, oh yes, it was the economics of the currency position which really concerned me, as opposed to saying, well, I really got taken in by these free chancellors when they came up and told me we could have all the powers we wanted if we voted no. The second thing to say, that's quite difficult for people to say, because it accepts that you were willing to be swayed by what became pretty obvious very soon was a guise, a manoeuvre. It's difficult, it's difficult to say. I mean, I had a constituent once, right? And this poor chap got taken, embezzled off him about £20,000 by a shyster organisation that claimed to be investing his money. He was an old chap, nice chap, in various wonderful get-rich-quick schemes, right? And even after, it was patently obvious that this organisation, which had been taking his money ruthlessly and disgracefully, was a front for just a racket. I couldn't get him to believe it, because the last thing he wanted to do for his own self-esteem, because this was an intelligent man in his late 70s, but still an intelligent man. The last thing he wanted to do for his self-esteem was to accept that he had been taken in, duped, made a fool of. People find it difficult to say that. Far better to say, oh no, I made an examination of the full implications of the currency question and came up with a different answer. That's human nature. And people who don't understand human nature don't understand politics, because if politics is about anything, it's about human nature. So of course, the Yes campaign should present a better case. We should improve the approach we take to a number of issues. But don't think either there's any easy answer in terms of a magic bullet to solve all problems, or for that matter, believe, because if the academics from Essex were master politicians, they'd be master politicians, not academics from Essex.
The most significant legacy of the referendum is certainly a democratic one. You've seen a noticeable increase in activism around issues such as fracking, the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, the women's prison in Inverclyde, huge organisations that have grown since the referendum. Do you think the Scottish Government benefits from campaigns that push for greater change from outside Parliament? Yeah,
I think if the Scottish Government's wise, then I think one of the great strengths of the Scottish Government in general, and Nicola Sturgeon's administration in particular, is that it's obviously open to ideas and to offerings from people. And I certainly tried to do that when I was First Minister, but I think in that atmosphere, if you're having an interactive referendum campaign, interactive in the sense that ideas are coming from the bottom up as well as from the top down, then there's no reason why you can't run a genuinely interactive government. And we did that. How did we do that? Well, what was one of the great symbols of difference between Scottish governance and Westminster governance? Wasn't it the two cabinet meetings, meeting on the same day in the northeast of Scotland? The UK cabinet meeting behind barbed wire, or if not actual barbed wire, then certainly metaphorical barbed wire, under tight security in the Shell headquarters of Shell Oil Corporation in Aberdeen. and the Scottish Cabinet meeting in Portleffen Church Hall, a few miles down the road, in an open public meeting, open to question. That seemed to me to strike an effective contrast between the style of two administrations. And I think Nicola, in terms of her response to a variety of issues, has indicated that style has also got substantial substance to it.
You yourself rose to prominence in your party with the reputation of a rebel, someone who challenged your own party's establishment. How important is it that internal dissent is allowed to continue to sort of challenge political establishments both in Scotland and across the UK? Oh,
hugely. And I mean, you read total rubbish in the press about this. I mean, the standing orders of a parliamentary group. I read this. That actually I read the Labour Party. The Labour Party, talking about how dreadful it was to have standing orders saying that people have to minute dissent before they speak out an issue. Of course you minute dissent before you speak out an issue. And that's the whole purpose of being this. How can you dissent unless you minute? You have to say it. I don't agree, and I want the right to say it. There's always, incidentally, in any party, there's always a tension. I mean, when somebody's elected, when I'm elected, when I was elected in Banff and Buchan in 1987, I was elected as Alex Salmond, but I was elected because I was the SNP candidate. I wasn't elected, as no candidate, as the voice of Alex Salmond. I was elected to articulate a case, as to represent my constituent, as any member of Parliament does, but I was to articulate a political case, and people who voted for me didn't vote for me in 1987 because they knew me. They voted me because I was the SNP candidate. And therefore, for MD to say, oh, well, I'll forget about being the SNP person, I'll just go and do what I like, it's silly. But equally, it's silly not to allow people the right to dissent. But if people dissent, then they owe it to their colleagues to say, look, this is an issue I can't go along with. Can I point to MSPs in the Scottish Parliament who've exercised that right? Christine Graham. Christine Graham has dissented on a number of issues, as you may have noticed, and has a perfect right to do so, and has always done so with great courtesy and respect to her colleagues. I've also found that the most cohesive parliamentary group I've ever been part of was the SNP group in the minority administration. And it wasn't cohesive because, I laid down the law to the parliamentary group. It was cohesive because, we were in the trenches together. We had the Labour, Tory, Liberals dying for something to go wrong, dying to upset our apple cart, dying to bring down the minority administration. And when you're in the trenches, as we were, it breeds a comradeship, which is difficult to break. So I think dissent's important in politics. I think the more important actually is how the SNP fashions itself for the new age. The Scottish National Party is now one of the relatively few parties in Western Europe which is genuinely a mass membership party. Not just a mass membership party, but an articulate, active, proactive membership. People who want to have their voice heard. And the SNP has to adapt its procedures. I mean, look, we had a conference, Nicola's conference, and the pre-election conference in the SECC. Right, this is a pre-election conference. It's like a spring conference, like a secondary conference, and they had 3,000 people there. They could have had 6,000, but they can't have 6,000 because there's nowhere to hold 6,000. So you have to find a way of having that sort of meeting in a way that can, with venues which can accommodate that sort of meeting. And how do you do it? Well, I think you have to evolve it structurally, geographically, perhaps. So as you have, broken down by geographical area, so that it's feasible in terms of size for people to genuinely participate. You can do it by subject, of course, so that you can have a special conference on the health service or whatever it might be. And you have to obviously match the conference itself with the online interactivity and make it a genuine debate. So a number of ways to do it, but it'll have to be done.
One of the reasons for the SNP's change in fortunes over the last number of years has been the transition to being seen as Scotland's party for social justice and having the mantle for social justice taken from the Labour Party. Just one of those issues that was agreed this week is obviously Nicola Sturgeon's government decision to prioritise land reform, which will be pushed forward at the Scottish Parliament before the summer recess, viewed as a crucial measure for economic development and rural land ownership. How important is the land reform agenda in Scotland for pushing for change and equality?
I think it's very important. When I was First Minister, I brought forward the million acres target for community ownership. We replenished the land fund to allow, because when I took office, there was a land fund with nothing in it, which is kind of difficult to affect much change if people can apply for a land fund with no budget. And we've been successful in both in certain spectacular community takeovers, but also symbolic things like we've got from the Mulla Galloway to Dunnet Head in the north of Scotland. The lighthouses are now under community ownership, and particularly happy about the north of Scotland example, since otherwise it would have been a firing range for the MOD. And I suppose on balance, if I have to weigh up the respective merits of another firing range for the Ministry of Defence against community ownership of a wonderful natural asset, marginally I'll come down in favour of the community ownership. So we've made substantial strides, and the land reform package we have now comes out of the consultation which I launched at Sommerostig last year. And I'm sure there's a great deal more to do. I think land reform is hugely important in Scotland. It has to be pursued in the right way. We have to make it clear that no one who responsibly manages land and uses it as a productive asset has anything to fear from this legislation. The only people who have something to fear is those who freeze land or who misuse it or abuse it or have it in, I think the legal term is, I may get this wrong, vicissitude, which is a bit like, let's say you're living in a house and your next door neighbour emigrates to Australia and allows his or her house to fall down, threatening your house, then you have the right under Scots law to effect repairs to that house because it threatens your house. Well, you can get situations like that in land ownership, where for a variety of reasons people choose not to use land productively but to depopulate it or to freeze it as an asset, or perhaps they don't really bother about managing or administering or having stewardship over the land. They just want to have it as a symbol or a prestige symbol, or because they think it will accumulate value in the future. So people have the right of land ownership, but nobody has an arbitrary authority over the land. As William Henry Seward once said, it was bestowed upon us by the creator of the universe. We are its stewards. So land should be held in stewardship, and good stewards, effective stewards, family farmers have nothing to fear from land reform. Communities, people who want to see the Highlands and Islands vibrant and populated and productive and enterprising, they have everything to gain.
From land reform to the history of democracy, it's the 250th anniversary of the birth of Thomas Muir, a political radical considered a father of Scottish democracy. You quoted him in your speech to SNP conference in 2011, Muir's speech from his trial, where he said, "I have devoted myself to the cause of the people. It is a good cause. It shall ultimately prevail. It shall finally triumph." In what ways does your cause of independence come from a desire to fulfil his cause of democracy?
Well, quite substantially. I mean, I think the whole Friends of the People, the 1820 Rising, Dick Gaughan's rendition of Thomas Muir of Hunter's Hill, I think that whole ethos is hugely important in Scottish society. You know, I took the American ambassador, it's in the book incidentally, to see Calton Cemetery. Ostensibly, I took him to see the statue of Abraham Lincoln, which I think is the only one in Scotland actually. It was a subscription of Civil War veterans who put the statue up. But I suppose what's even more interesting, well, there's two other things of great interest in Calton Cemetery, which is full of ex-Lord Provosts of Edinburgh, incidentally, and the mausoleums are in there. But there's also David Hume's tomb, which has one word in it, Hume. Well, nothing more had to be said, just Hume. And secondly, of course, the obelisk that people, I suppose, as they look up at Carlton Hill, see and see this big pointy object stretching up to the sky. And I wonder how many people wonder what it is. Well, of course, the pointy object is a monument to Thomas Muir and the Friends of the People and the 1820 martyrs. An interesting thing about it, in memory at least, it was erected about 1840-ish, about 20, 30 years after the Radical Rising and the impact of the Friends of the People. An interesting thing about it is that it shows change in society, right? In 1820, the Radical Rising, people were rounded up, and Bayard, Hardy and the rest of them, and either executed, transported or set to work building the Radical Road in Edinburgh. Thomas Muir had a variety of experiences promoting French Revolution, but none of which were particularly comfortable in Scotland. But within 20 years or so, maybe 30, 40 years of Thomas Muir, things had changed so much that Edinburgh City Council, Town Council, the Royal Borough of Edinburgh, sanctioned in their greatest cemetery a monument to exactly these thoughts, which could only have been done if a majority of the burgesses or councillors or deacons or bailies or whatever they were at that time decided they wanted to do it. So to me, it's an example of political change, of how things transfer. If you have the right idea, and as I was saying in that speech back in 2011, then of course the people who are on trial, it's their views that prevail, as Muir said in his trial. So I'll be speaking at the conference this summer on Muir, and again there's an event in the autumn. And I think it's a story. I mean, I was very irritated recently by the story about the Black Watch play getting effectively prescribed from a school curriculum in Angus. And it's nothing to do actually with the individual head teacher. It's to do with a position where I saw that the rector of Dundee High School took umbrage at criticism of the school and the head teacher for doing that. My criticism, and I think Ian Rankin's criticism as well. He didn't like that either. And he said it was akin to bullying, as he put it. Yeah. I would say, what is the greater outrage? Is it a situation where a major work of art, recognised internationally, which puts forward a certain point of view, artistic merit, can be withdrawn and made unavailable to pupils at a secondary school, effectively censured? Or is it that there's a bit of public controversy about the decision of that head teacher? Well, if you're apparently the rector of Dundee High School, you think it's the second. I think if you're interested in liberty of thought and concepts and artistic merit, you might think it's the first.
Another historical parallel that's perhaps significant for Scotland.
Incidentally, I would prepare to bet, and I stand open to correction, I may be doing the rector of Dundee High School an enormous disservice, but I would suspect somehow that the words Thomas Muir have never uttered his lips.
Well, maybe they will if he replies. The other parallel I was going to draw was the Irish experience and the campaign for Home Rule, which held the balance of power to deliver change, or attempts to deliver change from Westminster. What lessons should a contingent of Scottish MPs take from that experience?
From the Irish experience? You mean as in Parnell and the Irish Party?
Exactly.
Well, I mean, Scotland isn't Ireland. Scotland, the 20th century, the 21st century is not the same as the 19th century. There are huge differences in House of Commons procedures. I happen to know that. I examined most of the House of Commons procedures. Actually, Parnell altered the House of Commons. The procedures of the House of Commons were hugely changed post-Parnell because of Parnell's tactics, brilliantly successful tactics at various times. So they changed the entire procedures of the House of Commons to make it, as it were, less democratic, even less democratic, to prevent individual members of parliament or small groups having their way, but none of that matters if you have the balance. If you have the balance, then you have the power. And the trick is, as Nicola has rightly said, is to use that influence in a productive way. And to use that influence so as it benefits Scotland, but also to make alliances with other progressive forces to push things forward in a general direction. I think it's a symptom of the malaise in the metropolitan media. Not that they misunderstand Scotland, which they've done for a long time, but they actually misunderstand England. They actually think that everybody in England thinks like the Daily Mail. And of course, some people do, no doubt. And I dare say there's saloon bars across the home counties where you could meet people who think exactly like that. But that's not England. That's a certain segment of English society. There's lots and lots of people in England would like nothing more than to see the House of Commons have a more progressive view of people across the country. Lots and lots of people.
Links into the election campaign itself, which is undoubtedly a significant election with the prospect of a Future of Scotland Act and diverse economic strategies across the different leaders, and of course a debate over the Maingate Trident decision, which is scheduled for 2016. There's also been a great deal of speculation and focus on personality in the leaders. If you're looking at policy, what does success look like for the SNP 5 years down the line?
In terms of what has been achieved, well, success for the SNP would be to deliver what Scotland was promised. And what Scotland was promised, of course, was not the anemic version of the spring of 2015, but the full-blown version of the week before the referendum. That is, Devo to the max, to quote the Daily Record, near federalism, as to quote Gordon Brown, and home rule as to quote everybody. And there's not, the Smith Commission results, certainly the command paper that arose from it can be called a whole range of things, but it's certainly not Devo to the max, near federalism or home rule, and nobody could possibly pretend that it is. So to deliver the promise, the commitment, the vow that was made to Scotland and to see it redeemed in full measure, that would be a significant key aim. Secondly, as Nicola has spelt out, the delivery of a move away from austerity, to use influence to, the Labour Party have got itself throttled onto the Conservative economic agenda. A major mistake. The first mistake, of course, was Miliband appointing Balls to be Shadow Chancellor. You don't appoint somebody who's tarnished by the record of the previous Labour administration. But the second mistake is to allow themselves to be triangulated into the Tory austerity agenda. What people are looking for is an alternative, not a substitute for austerity. And Nicola has said that out and set it out very well in my estimation. So that would be a second cardinal thing. Thirdly, the things that arise from that. What does an end to austerity mean for real people? Well, I can take some examples. It would mean that ATOS will be sent packing from their persecution of people with disabilities. That would be a tangible example of what an end to austerity means. From a Scottish perspective, there might be things like saving Longanet Power Station by changing the rules, which are closing it down. But there'll be objectives of social justice and economic progress, which an end to austerity means. Make no mistake, if you're going to reduce public spending by another 30 billion, as Labour proposed, you're not ending austerity, you're continuing austerity. And if you are, as Nicola has proposed, expanding public spending by a reasonable, responsible amount, but still expanding it, then you are ending austerity. And you've got the ability to spell out what that end to austerity actually means to real people. And then, of course, you mentioned the Gateway decision in Trident, which is going to be a crucial decision. The idea that under the circumstances of tight economics, either a continuation of austerity with Labour, Tory, Liberals, there'll be somewhere in between, or an end to it, but still a tight budget, that you would countenance spending £100 billion over the next generation on Trident missiles, new generation, is ridiculous. It's ludicrous. It's a vanity project, and nothing more than that. So therefore, hopefully, under the right circumstances, with the right arithmetics of this, then the SNP votes will be decisive in that direction.
The Scottish National Party and yourself personally have received a great deal of free advertising from your political opponents. Do you think the culture of personality politics in Scotland and the UK detracts from the politics of policy and ideas that you've just outlined?
Well, let's have a quick look, shall we? It's just me in there. So, just checking my top pocket. I said at the conference, I don't mind this stuff. It's a silly advertising campaign. It's from a Tory perspective. It promotes the SNP, so we shouldn't complain about it. Fine. It also promotes Miliband, if he had the common sense to realise it. Anything from a governing party which says that the opposition party is going to be Prime Minister is a ludicrous advert. You should never ever cast the opposition leader as Prime Minister under any circumstances, whether it be with Alex Salmond or Gerry Adams or anything. You should never do that. It is a sign of incredible weakness. It's a sign that, you know, when you allow Linton Crosby to run your election campaign, you're halfway on the road to perdition. And the Tories are probably more than halfway on the road to perdition, I would say. So, personality politics, look, personalities will always be in politics. It's not the personality aspect that makes me feel this is ludicrous. It's the idea you put your opponents on your election posters. Why on earth would you spend time advertising your opponents? It's a ridiculous, silly thing to do. I don't know if it works in Australia. I mean, the only thing I know about Australian politics is how unsuccessful John McTiernan was when he was a proponent in Australian politics, which is why I'm delighted that Jim Murphy has brought him back to Scotland. You know, he can complete a hat-trick now. You know, he failed in 2011 in Scotland, he failed in Australia, and now he can come back to Scotland and fail again. Great.
So the main SNP pitch at this election is that they will hold the balance of power through either a confidence arrangement with Labour or on a vote-by-vote basis. You've mentioned elsewhere the significance of the Fixed Term Parliament Act under such conditions, which could potentially lock a minority government in for 5 years without an election. Does the Fixed Term Parliament Act strengthen the SNP's position?
Yes.
Why?
Because the Prime Ministerial prerogative, previously in Westminster, if the Prime Minister had a prerogative, which was to call an election, if he couldn't get his or her way, they no longer have that under that Act. You've got to convince a majority, or by a certain reading of the Act, 2/3 actually, but a majority of the Commons to go along with you. It's usually difficult to get a majority for dissolution. Why? Because if one side is up, the other side's down. If there's no natural majority, the chances are that there'll be a majority for not dissolving Parliament. But the Prime Ministerial prerogative of going for an election has been removed, and because of that, it strengthens the hands of, well, it strengthens the hands firstly of the House of Commons, and it strengthens the hands of other parties within the House of Commons. That's obvious now. It is passing strange that those MPs, parties who passed the Fixed Term Parliament Act, seem to have passed it without reading it.
Other influences in a hung parliament scenario which haven't received a great deal of attention are the positions of the civil service and the financial markets. So in 2010, for instance, former Permanent Secretary Lord Turnbull said that in any inter-party deal it would have to be concluded in a week, or the markets would lack confidence in the stability of that new government. How do you see those pressures operating in a hung parliament scenario?
I mean, they're factors. I mean, I tend not to put too much credence on those who believe in the magic of the markets. Markets adjust. The markets bolt in uncertainty in elections. The markets always adjust to just about everything. And most people who talk about the overwhelming power, overweening power of the markets don't actually understand how they work. And if they did, incidentally, they would be like John Maynard Keynes and make a lot of money out of them. So I'm always suspicious of top civil servants and others who talk about with awe about the power of the markets. You know, if they knew as much about the markets as they pretend to be, they wouldn't be top civil servants. They'd be top traders in various market mechanisms. Markets tend to buy in. I mean, what matters in that situation is you have a clear route forward. Do I think it's a good idea to draw out negotiations for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks? No, I think you're far better to get it done as quickly as you can. And but that's not because of markets. That's because you want a government in to set a direction. I mean, that's what we did in 2007 in the Scottish Parliament. I see absolutely no reason if arithmetic. But one interesting thing, of course, is that if you're a believer in the overweening power of the markets, then what the markets need, of course, is to know that there's a confident majority. On current formulations, things could change. There's weeks to go in this campaign. The only secure majority is a Labour SNP one. That's the only secure, but you couldn't have a majority. I mean, what are the markets? What would Lord Turnbull think of a, let's see, what would it be? A Conservative, Liberal, Ulster Unionist, UKIP? Well, that'd be stable, wouldn't it?
Do you think there's a case that top civil servants and market fundamentalists should be backing a SNP Labour government if they want stability?
Well, no, I'm not going to say exactly that because I'd be kind of misquoted and traduced in a new advert or something. But not by you, of course. But no, I think there is a logic which might take you there, that in these situations what you want to know is there is a secure majority to pursue a programme. That's what you want. And it's very difficult under certain circumstances, and I say things could change entirely. You know, we're at an early stage in the election campaign. As you know, I'm an admirer of Harold Wilson. One of his most famous sayings is, "A week's a long time in politics, 5 weeks an eternity." But right now, it's very difficult to see a stable coalition of the right, Tories, Liberals, Ulster Unionists, UKIP. Sounds like a nightmare for any market, even for some top civil servant. Maybe Sir Nicholas Macpherson would be pleased, but he seems to have an extraordinary interest in politics.
This week, Labour's John MacDonald MP signalled that there might be 30 to 40 Labour MPs who would vote against Ed Miliband on the basis of opposing austerity cuts. And does this open up and strengthen potential cooperation between a SNP group in the Parliament and people on the left of the Labour Party?
I know John MacDonald, he's a fine member of Parliament. I tend to judge my members of Parliament, obviously partly in their views. You obviously like people who tend to agree with you in certain aspects. Not in everything, John, of course, but in certain aspects. But I also tend to judge them on how hard they work. I mean, I used to share a corridor with Dave Nellist, who was a militant Labour MP. I didn't agree with Dave on lots of things, but I would find it hard to find a more hard-working member of Parliament. He was the only person that was still there when I was there, working on his constituency staff. So I held him in high regard. I hold John MacDonald in high regard, but in certain aspects I agree with John, and I think the reasons that the Labour Party are spouting this austerity nonsense, and it is nonsense. I mean, 2 weeks ago, the Financial Times had an editorial in the run-up to the budget, questioning whether austerity under the current circumstances was necessary or whether a move away from austerity would be better, because the major risk to the UK economy that the Financial Times leader indicated was a deflationary tendency, not an inflationary tendency. We seem to arrive at a position where the Financial Times is to the left of the Labour Party leadership. So it does allow a fair amount of scope for responsible dialogue. But the reason that the Labour Party leadership have got itself into that absurd position, which is where they are now, is of course they believe that it makes them electable. Some people would disagree with that. Some people would say you're at the position where the Financial Times leader it probably indicates there's a fair margin for electability. But of course, by definition, if it's about making you electable, once there is a government in situ, then the whole parameters change. And certainly there would be an undergrowth, as there would be in Trident, incidentally, of people within the ranks of the Labour Party who did not think that the position being spouted by the Labour leadership, which most people are taking a vow of silence on, not John MacDonald, of course, but a lot of people are taking a vow of silence on, wouldn't hold in that post-election atmosphere. And therefore, I think there's a productive job to be done in the interests of Scotland, but also in the interests of progressive politics.
So from your description of Labour dressing up in blue to a slightly different angle of you dressing up in pink, obviously Angry Salmond Twitter account, the satirical take on your political views has grown in popularity, and has made a certain pink beret that you wore raising money for cancer charities rather famous. Just curious to know whatever happened to it.
Well, the pink beret has many manifestations. I get asked for it, and I got asked for it so often I bought a few, and I keep sending people the latest version. I mean, I've never told them there was only one beret, but I keep getting asked for it, so I thought it best to invest in a few berets. And I tell people, here's the latest one. But I turn up at meetings, and there are rows of people sitting with pink berets on. I turned out, I was at a meeting in Stirling University in McRoberts Centre the other night, about 500 folk there, and there was a row of yellow berets who had kind of segued on from the pink berets. But I like the pink beret stuff because of the campaign it was associated with. I was actually, Christina McKelvey had asked me to do that picture as First Minister, and Angry Salmond, he or she, has taken that picture to make it their motif. Incidentally, as a parody site, Angry Salmond has more visitors than Jim Murphy's official site. I just mentioned this in passing. But I'm pleased about the breast cancer awareness. I'm in the great position of great good fortune that I've just I'm able to give it a substantial charitable donation from an event I did for the Bank of America in the last few days, and I'm really pleased to be in a position to do that because I feel that given that Angry Salmond and the parody site has had so much mileage out of the Wear It Pink campaign, that it's nice to be able to support it as well. But I'd love to know and listen, anybody watching this modest broadcast, if you know who Angry Salmond actually is, I wonder if he or she would own up. I would do. I mean, I know it would take away one of life's great mysteries, but I would be interested to know.
So from that important message, the final and slightly more serious question to finish the interview, will the impact of the referendum be your most significant political legacy, or do you think a more significant chapter is yet to be written?
Well, as I say, that remains to be seen.
Thanks, Alex, for the interview.